don't even know if they're still alive. Closure is not something that ghosters give. I don't know if it's harder to be the person that gets ghosted or ghosts somebody.
Makes sense.
There's no goodbye. There's no explanation, just silence. If you've ever been ghosted by a close friend or someone that you loved, your brain probably didn't register that a breakup took place. It actually gets stuck when this happens, and it's stuck in a loop of what's called ambiguous loss. And we'll get into that a little bit more. What it's doing is searching for closure that never came. That's kind of what our brains look for, closure. We have to understand, we have to give meaning to things. So today we're going to break down the psychology of ghosting. And I've put a lot of work into this. So you're going to really love this. Because if you can learn how to change the way you look at ghosting and manage it differently, it's going to greatly lessen the odds of you getting knocked off course and spending your whole day, your whole week, a whole month, a whole year, a whole life trying to figure these things out. So we're going to break down the psychology of ghosting, why it hurts more than a normal breakup. You know, when you get ghosted, you say, man, I would love to just go back to a normal breakup. And why friendship breakups can cut even deeper than your traditional breakup, and why their silence is not a verdict of your worth. That's going to be one of the big takeaways. So by the end of this episode, my hope is that I want you to see something very, very clearly. When you get ghosted, what you're going to learn is their disappearance is not a form of rejection, but one more of incapacity. Make sense? So ghosting is one of the strangest human behaviors that we've ever normalized. That's what's interesting about ghosting is somehow it's been normalized. Let's say, oh yeah, I got ghosted, you know? And I think we have to normalize it, because if you look at it and say, and as an abnormal thing, you could probably make too much out of it. We have to get on with our lives, right? So we've normalized it. So what it represents is it's that moment when someone knows your whole story. So this is the person, your struggles, your inner world, and then poof, abracadabra, shazam, nothing. No explanation, no attempt at repair, no explanation. That's the hard part. And no final closing line or sentence. No thing. Nothing at all. Nothing. And here's the weirdest part about it all. The hardest thing about ghosting isn't that the person is gone. This is fascinating when you've been ghosted. It's that the story has no ending. That's what's tough about ghosting, is there's no closure, but there's no ending. There's no explanation. And it's only in that moment that you as a human realize how important that is to you. And you'd like to think that you'd never do that to somebody else, but I'm almost positive that we've all ghosted somebody. So your brain, remember this, your brain is a meaning-making machine. And when something stops without an explanation, it doesn't shut down. The meaning-making machine doesn't shut down when something stops with no explanation at all. It starts searching. That's what we do. Replaying the last conversation, rereading every one of the last texts. You know, we go back to the evidence and check the facts, and wondering why that person stopped texting all of a sudden. No explanation. Wondering how long you should wait before realizing that you've been ghosted. I don't know what people think, like how long before you realize that you've been ghosted. I don't know if it's harder to be the person that gets ghosted or ghosts somebody. And when there's no information, the brain feverishly starts to fill in the blanks. And that's where we get into trouble. So this usually begins with self-blame. Is it something that I did? And what's interesting about looking at yourself, especially if you're someone that likes to take responsibility for yourself and take ownership, which you'll find if you're not the kind of person that takes ownership for your own part in things, when you've been ghosted, you are more prone to, because you can't figure it out. You look at them and say, I don't know why they left, because you don't know what's going on. There's no information. So you naturally go back to yourself and say, I must have done something. And you almost want to know what you've done, but you can't figure it out because there's no information. So this is why ghosting often hurts more, as I said before, than just a regular relationship. So in a breakup, this is really fascinating about the difference between ghosting and a breakup. In a breakup, there's language. You'll never appreciate a breakup so much until you've been ghosted. So there's language, there's conflict, there's at least a reason why your nervous system can organize things around it. Like ghosting completely removes the narrative. That's what's so fascinating about ghosting. It's almost like a magic trick. Poof, puff of smoke, and then the smoke clears, the person's gone, no reason why, and you never get to learn the trick behind the magic. So in psychology, this is referred to as well as ambiguous loss. Now, here's what ambiguous loss is. Ambiguous loss is a loss with no clarity, no closure, and no ritual, ritual. It's ambiguous. The person is gone, but not gone enough for your body to release them. There's no permission to grieve someone who is still alive. In fact, you don't even know if they're still alive, especially when they completely detach from you and block you and all of this stuff. You don't even know if they're still alive. So part of the game and part of the stitching and making up of a story is, well, I hope they're okay, because I know that nobody would ever do this. So they have become a ghost, which is interesting about the ghosting, right? So the loss just lingers like a smell, like a scent. And while it does, the nervous system stays fully activated. So I find that's what's important. You know, if you look at the interface response system, step one is to just be self-aware and understand how the brain works. And if you understand that even though somebody's dropped you like a bad habit, but that your nervous system is seeking meaning and seeking sense, and it's fully activated, that's important for you to know, because very often the subconscious components of our brain are in full action, and we think that it's like something that we're consciously doing. So this is where attachment theory helps make sense of things. So now we're going to get into a little bit of the sense-making component of it. So most people assume that ghosting is some sort of a form of cruelty. That's the visceral knee-jerk reaction. Some sort of cruelty, manipulation, or some sort of emotional abuse. Like, hey, that's really fucked up. Sometimes we even say, that's really sick. That's a sick person right there. And you're saying that about somebody that like hours prior was one of your closest friends, you know, in your inner sanctum. And you know what? Sometimes it is. Sometimes it is a little bit of a form of abuse. But the question is what is it intended abuse? Sometimes it could be. But more often, and remember, we're talking right now about the attachment theory. More often, ghosting is avoidant attachment activating under pressure. And here's what that means. It's an insecure attachment style where individuals highly value independence in that moment. They suppress emotions and struggles with intimacy. When our emotional closeness to somebody exceeds someone, so this is the person that's getting ghosted, when that emotional closeness that we have with that person, when that exceeds their internal capacity to handle it, their nervous system says, abort, let's get the hell out of here. And they process it and they say, should I explain myself? Should I let them know? But explaining themselves in that moment probably feels exposing, and confronting things and creating conflict probably feels threatening as well. They don't want to threaten you. They don't want to threaten themselves. They're taking the easy way out, which a lot of us do. And also the idea of staying and working through things may very well feel overwhelming for them. So the system chooses its default mode and withdraws. Fuck everything and run. That's a normal human thing. It's just that when it's happening to you and you don't know why, you don't see it that way typically. So this is an unconscious form of nervous system regulation. We're always looking to regulate our nervous systems. This is one of the reasons why we have overeating and social media problems. We're always trying to regulate our nervous system, very often by removing the feeling that we don't like. And ghosting is one of those things that we rationalize as a remedy. So it's an unconscious form of nervous system regulation through avoidance. The strategy to disappear rather than explain. Ghosting someone is not a statement about one's worth. That's an important distinction when you get ghosted. It's not a statement of your self-worth. It's actually a reflection of the person's emotional capacity at that moment in their life. Now, here's what's interesting. Even if somebody has a valid reason, like they really don't like you all of a sudden, or they heard a rumor, or unbeknownst to you, you said something that was over the tipping point, the fact that they're ghosting you, completely detaching with no explanation at all, means that in some level, it's a reflection of their emotional capacity at that moment, that they can't handle explaining themselves. If you're ever blessed, and I have been, this is fascinating about ghosting. If you're ever blessed with one day having a conversation with the ghost, they resurface, right? The ghost reappears and you somehow get an opportunity to reconnect and say, what the fuck happened? What happened? Like, it comes back and you're just like, oh my God, am I going to find out what actually happened? More often than not, here's what's interesting about this. And this might be correlated to the fact that they resurfaced, right? But more often than not, from my experience, what you find out is that they didn't leave because you mattered too little to them. That's not why they left. They left because staying would have required a conversation that they didn't know how to have, or they didn't have the capacity, there's that word again, to have. So that's a very different story. And I've been blessed with having a best friend, my BFF, completely ghost me, and then coming back to him one day and be like, you know, I don't know what happened. Like, I would assume that I did something really bad, and I didn't. I didn't. It was a capacity issue. And when you don't understand that, your brain, 95% of it doing its own thing without you being asked, your brain turns their silence into evidence against you or against them. So nobody wins in that scenario. So I like to remind myself about that no-win situation. And if you're gonna make up a story, I would encourage you to make up a story that suits you best, right? Because sometimes we make up a story that we think that it gives us closure and it helps us separate, but what it really does is it actually, you know, just becomes like this backpack full of rocks on our shoulder. So I want to talk about something that one of our listeners, I don't know if he's here today, but if he is, he can chime in. Bharat, Bharatw. You can find him on Substack. Made a really cool distinction, and I want to share that with you. So I rewrote what he said just to make sense of it. But there's a subtle but interesting and important difference between ghosting and the idea of placing someone in a sealed container. So with ghosting, the power actually stays with the other person. When you ghost somebody, you're giving them. So if you really want to get rid of somebody, ghosting is not always the best way, because you're leaving some of the power with them. You're still calculating your moves, replaying conversations, wondering what to say when you ghost somebody. So a sealed container is different. It's clarity. You know who you care for and what you're available for. Right? You're making the rules, right? And you stop orbiting the uncertainty. Forgiveness often shows up as a byproduct, and you get to move on with your exploration when you put them in a sealed container. Ghosting, here's the big distinction from Bharat. Ghosting creates distance and erodes respect. So just identify that for a second. Identify what happens to respect for the other person when they ghost you. It's really interesting. I would say, for the most part, I lack respect for the person that they did that. Now, there's ways of reframing it and getting over it and stuff, but that's the difference between ghosting and putting somebody in a sealed container. And I, for one, if I ever put somebody in jail, if I'm going to put them in a sealed container, if I want to just get them out of my life, I, for one, have learned that I feel much better by approaching them and letting them know. So that's just my own. So is ghosting emotional abuse, or is it just a form of avoidance? This is fascinating. So the honest answer to a question like that, is it abuse or just avoidance, is it depends, right? C'est dépend, French. It depends on the intent and the pattern of the ghosting. There's different types of ghosting, but in most cases, you don't get to know those things. In most everyday friendships, ghosting isn't a power play of some sort. It's more of a breakdown in the communication under emotional strain. When there's emotional strain, which, by the way, if you're being ghosted, you might not know about that emotional strain. You might have an inkling and you might be able to justify, oh, they're overwhelmed. They probably can't handle me, which doesn't feel good, but it's not like emotional abuse. It's more of removing yourself from something that you can't handle. And by the way, like the complicated art and science and philosophy of forgiveness, a lot of people struggle to forgive. Understanding that it's less about you and more about them, it doesn't excuse the behavior. The reason why we struggle with forgiveness is we don't want to excuse their behavior. But what it does when you forgive, or you let something go like this, what it does is it frees you from carrying the wrong meaning. Isn't that the challenge? How we are meaning making machines, sense making and meaning making machines, and we very often give things the wrong meaning. And if we carry around the wrong meaning, which in many, many cases, I would even venture to say more cases than not, it's the wrong meaning. And if we carry that around, that's where the suffering begins. So once the wrong meaning loses its grip because you've let go of it or you've forgiven, we can move to a more manageable way to navigate it. And what that is empathy. So here's the part that nobody wants to hear. Closure, because we're all seeking closure. Closure is not something that ghosters give. So if somebody ghosts you, they don't give you closure. It's something that you create. So if you're like kind of feeling entitled to some sort of an explanation and you're going to hold your ground with your arms crossed, you'd better pick up some extra food and some extra clothes and some sort of way of showering every now and then, because it might be a while. So you don't get closure by forcing a conversation that someone is unwilling to have or unable to have. You get closure when you've been ghosted. You get closure by replacing a false story that's going on in your brain with a more accurate one. Now, accurate is a funny thing to say because it's probably more one that suits you. But here's the funny thing about creating an accurate story. You're going to go through a process with me right now. We're going to do the interface response system. We're going to run it on ghosting. And this is the big distinction. So step one of the 4-step interface response system. By the way, when my book comes out, I'm going to be inviting a lot of you to my my friends and family launch. That's going to be, if you want to save the date and reach out to me, it's only going to be for a certain amount of people. My book launches live. That makes sense. How to rewire your mind and transform your life. And it's 8 years of work. It's everything that I ever made a distinction about, I share in this book. It's a fantastic book, or at least I think it does, or it is. But the flagship program in it and what we teach and what we work on in the Make Sense Academy is called the Interface Response System. So we're going to run that 4-step process on ghosting right now. So step one of the Interface Response System is called perceive. They're all P's. So the first thing that we need to do to recover and get back on track is take note of what actually happened. They stopped communicating and you don't know why. All you know is that they stopped communicating. So just grab onto that right now and accept it for what it is and what it isn't. Step two is a practice in cognitive distancing. You see it on my hat every day. It's the pause. And we say, and as a reminder, stands for haven't made up my mind, right? We're just pausing our knee-jerk, reflexive conditioned ideas and story. And we're just saying, okay, hold one second. And we're just going to move into a curious space. pause before assigning blame to yourself or to them. You can always come back to blaming yourself or them. That's what's funny about the pause, but pause it for a few. Take a secchi. Take a secchi. Okay, so now that you've paused it, just like Viktor Frankl says, now you're in the space in between the stimulus and your response. It's a very healthy place to be. You've put your conditioned knee-jerk reflex survival mode response on pause, and you're in this space where you can do step 3, and that is process. Now, while we're in the process stage of the interface response system, we get to process the behavior through things like attachment avoidance and nervous system overwhelm. We start to consider what might actually be going on in their world and not make it all about what happened to us. Consider some alternative scenarios and vantage points. Remember, hurt people hurt people. That's a great thing to remember. And this is probably not about me and I can't control it and all of those things. And they don't intend to hurt others. It's more about attempting to regulate themselves. I don't care what the scenario is, even if they're mad at you and you unknowingly did something to them, their intention when they ghost you is not to hurt you. It's about their own self-regulation. They're looking to regulate themselves and they've just chosen that way. Step 4 is proceed. So now we're going to create a healthy response. We were in reaction mode. And now we're going to create a healthy response. Respond first by releasing the need for answers from this person who could not stay present. So closure doesn't require explanation, my friends. If closure requires explanation and nobody gives you an explanation, you're in trouble. It requires facts and truth. Since there are no facts and truth and they're not providing any, you make up your own. And acknowledge that for the most part, you don't know. So you want a fact and a truth about what happened? You don't know. Grab onto that. I don't know. Embrace that unknowingness and go on with your life. Go on with your life's plans. They have not destroyed your life's plans. You still have them. So perhaps it's time to stop believing that true freedom, joy, happiness, and comfort exist out there rather than in here. Perhaps it's time to recognize that all of the things that you require to experience joy, happiness, and comfort are not outside. They're already inside. So we don't have to put so much weight on other people and other things. So if you change the way you look at things, the things you look at begin to change, don't they? So it's typically due to some sort of a wound that is still open inside of you, by the way. When you take offense to something, it's typically some sort of a wound inside of you. And what hurts is not what people did to you, it's what they activated inside of you. Everything that comes from the outside only has power when it finds an echo inside of you. Let me say that again. Everything that exists on the outside of us only carries power when it has the ability to find an echo inside of you. Become echoless. You want to hear something really interesting? One of my favorite paradoxes is the ultimate way to gain control is to release yourself from trying to control. It's the ultimate form of control. That's why it's difficult, by the way, to get ghosted. And that's why sometimes it leaves scars. You didn't get any say in the matter and you feel vulnerable. And if you perhaps made a mistake in letting this one in. So we start to blame ourselves. Like, how could I be so stupid? So here's something to consider as we move to the close. Not every relationship ends with a conversation. I know that we think they're supposed to, but they don't. Not every loss comes with some sort of an explanation. And not every unanswered question needs to be answered by the person who left. Sometimes the real work is just in realizing that. So they didn't disappear because you were unworthy. They did so because they reached their capacity. So that's a good place for that empathy. And that, my friends, makes more sense and carries the strength to, as Bob Marley would say, emancipate yourself from mental slavery. And that would be the mental slavery of ghosting. Makes sense? So have an amazing day being the dominant force and shot caller of your day. You do have a choice, and hope everything goes your way. Love and appreciate you. Have an amazing day. Bye-bye now.
Makes sense.